Gonna get into this week. That's guy.
Have this, because it's actually pretty significant.
It's
Hello, Ruth. Can I just do a quick
It
check
is
with
doing
you
it.
and just make sure
He
that
just
good on
plays
your
here.
end?
He's so frustrated.
Can you hear me okay?
I'm sure it's,
Yeah,
I
you
think
can
there's
hear
no
me
reason
okay?
for it to take this long. Especially a house that should have been grandfathered in, but
There's a house there already, right?
it's a house there, but it's gonna start all over with a secondary residence. It's just stupid.
Cover over this.
Fridays are actually the best days.
Well, it's muted now.
Friday.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, busy, but it's pretty good.
It's Friday.
Yours?
Same, busy, it's good.
Try to
Another way for
Thank you.
Okay,
Are you go away in the summer or is it too busy?
we can try.
No, it's good.
Now,
It's the busy season, right?
Hi, Randy, can you hear us okay?
We're all good.
Okay, perfect, yeah, then we can hear you as well. Thank you. Get started in just less than a minute here.
What time does that start? 3?
Let's
pick a time.
Two o'clock. Okay, and we're ready.
I'll catch up.
Right, good afternoon, everyone. I will call to order this meeting of the Agricultural Advisory Committee of Thursday, September 12th, 2024. Can I get a motion to adopt the agenda, please? Moved by Brad, second by Matt. All in favor? None opposed, motion carried. And adoption of the minutes of the last meeting. Moved by Matt, second by Brad. All in favor? None opposed, motion's carried. All right, moving down to reports, 6.1.
All right, I'll be presenting a project to update our DCC program. And what comes along with that now is a creation of an amenity cost charge program. That's some new legislation that's in place and allowing us to do that. And the third piece is looking at and revising our community amenity contributions policy, which is something that was put in place last year. There's significant overlap between that and the other two. So that's why that one's coming up too, but we'll go into the details as we get along here. So we'll start by talking about a little bit of context and explaining what these things are, talking about the process that we've used to go and do the updates, and that's for the all three of those. We'll look at some details on the DCC capital program, look at the comparison of the rates, the proposed ones to the current ones, and then also looking at rate comparisons between communities. We'll do the same thing for ACCs to the extent available, and then talk about next steps. So this is a fourth committee meeting out of 4 that we are coming to in September, looking for feedback, and we appreciate any comments. We have other avenues for feedback that we'll mention at the end of the presentation. So before I get too far into it, I'll just introduce James Glucas here with Urban Systems, who's been helping us with this project and will be available to help me answer questions later on. So diving into this presentation then, so first off, there was some provincial legislation changes that allows opportunities for us to look at different projects to fund. We'll be doing all 3 of these programs, one of them new, 2 of them existing that we'll be updating, and then we'll look for any feedback at the end. So quick context, DCCs are development cost charges. They're levied on development to help pay growth-related infrastructure or the growth-related portion of infrastructure. Council adopted the latest DCC bylaw in December 2021 with rates effective on January 1st, 2022, and then we did a quick rate update for CPI in 2023. The ACCs, the amenity cost charges, are new cost charges available through new legislation, and they are almost identical to DCCs in the way that they work. The key thing being here that the province has now introduced legislation that allows charges to be collected for purposes of things like community centers, recreational facilities, libraries, daycare, public squares. These are things that were not available under the former DCC program. And then lastly, the community amenity contributions charge, something that was the program and the policy adopted by council last fall. That particular charge covers a number of different areas that have now significant overlap given the new legislation on DCCs and ACCs. And so we need to make changes there to ensure that we're not doubling up on collecting fees for specific purposes. So more background on this, through advocacy efforts at UBCM, Abbotsford Council successfully lobbied the province to change the legislation, allow us to put highway interchanges into the roads program, the roads DCC program that is. For anyone that was around in 2021 when the last program was developed, you may remember that the city did attempt to put highway interchanges into that program, but when it went for review by the province said, no, you have to take those things out. So they're not currently in the program because of that, but because of the new legislative change now, we are able to put those back in. So that's one of the key things, one of the reasons why we're bringing this forward. The new legislation also provides for new rate categories, and so that includes fire, police, and solid waste facilities. So we've looked at our plans to see what we should do with that. The province also introduced the ACC program, again, very similar to DCCs, and just provides us other areas of ability to collect in the parks, recreation, and culture areas. The CAC, as I mentioned, there's some overlap now. We need to make some updates to that. And then lastly, there has, of course, been some very significant construction cost inflation since the creation of the program, and that small CPI increase that we did last year was nowhere near sufficient to address the cost increases that we've been seeing over the last several years. This is a graphical representation of the development cost charge programs. On the left, the existing is what we have right now. The sewage is actually two separate programs, a collection program and a treatment program, and the water's also two with a distribution and a treatment parts. So there's actually 7 existing programs. The ones that were added through the new legislation include the fire protection, the police, the solid waste and recycling, and then the transportation, the highway facilities there is really those interchanges being slid into the existing highway facilities program. The amenity cost charges, I already went over this. These are the new categories that are permitted through that new legislation. So this shows a comparison of what we have at the city existing, that's the top row, and then Bill 46, the bottom row, is what's being proposed. So if we start on that top left box there, the development cost charges, we see those 5, which I've already explained is actually technically 7 different programs. And then if you look at the box beneath it, you'll see those 3 extra ones, the highway facilities, those interchanges, the emergency services, which is both police and fire, and then waste and recycling. So we're taking advantage of those and looking at what projects should be incorporated there. If we slide over one column to the CACs and density bonusing program, again, that one was adopted last fall. That collects funds that are then distributed into a number of different areas, priority areas identified by council, and they include emergency services, culture, recreation, and affordable housing. Now, because those areas have significant overlap, we're going to be moving some charges out of there. So the emergency services portion we'll be taking and putting in with DCCs because that's now permissible under the legislation. The culture and recreation components of the CAC and density bonusing will be moving into the amenity cost charges program that we're recommending, and that will leave the affordable housing. That's the only component that's left under CACs and density bonusing that has nowhere else to go, and it's sitting there quite nicely. We'll leave it there, but we'll reduce the CAC and density bonusing rates in order to reflect that we're not doubling up on the charges. So an overview of how we've approached this. So firstly, I mentioned adjusting the capital costs for inflation, so that was a key piece of this. Number 2, updating to reflect new legislation, so the new fire, policing, solid waste categories. I haven't mentioned yet small-scale multi-unit housing, another area of new provincial legislation. We needed to make sure that the land use categories that we use to apportion the rates for DCCs reflects this new category, and so we've made some administrative changes to ensure that that's included as well. The third point, important one, is we're not making any other changes to assumptions around growth. Those are staying the same from the current program. The approach to benefit allocation per project is staying the same. Municipal assist factors are staying the same. These are all things that we would open up and explore again and review when we get to a full-scale DCC program update, and that will happen after we're finished our current OCP update, which is just getting underway. That will be followed by some master plan updates, and then following those, we'd be going through a full DCC review in 2 to 3 years. But for now, we're leaving those assumptions in bullet point number 3 there, all the same, and really focusing on the first two. So talking about that first point now, the construction inflation, we took the approach of taking a look at all the different projects that are in our existing DCC program and have been for a number of years, going back and identifying the projects that we've begun work on or completed, and identifying how did tender prices come back, and how did that compare to what the budgets were, what the estimates were in the existing program. And we realized that for an awful lot of our projects, we were seeing actual prices coming in 50% higher than what was actually in the DCC program. So a lot of our projects have a 50% inflationary factor built in recognition of that. We also went out and looked at some third-party evidence. So I should first say that what I just talked about, reviewing the different costs, that was Abbotsford-specific data, looking at Abbotsford projects. The Building Construction Price Index from Statistics Canada is a national indicator that we looked at, so it's not specifically related to us, but we wanted to know, is there some indicator out there that tells us if we're in the right ballpark? Does this make sense? And this is what that graph on the right shows, is it's also showing a very significant increase in that particular statistic. Flipping over to the ACC bylaw now, and I'll mention again, the ACC legislation is almost identical to the DCC, so a lot of similarities there. As I mentioned too, the ACC legislation focuses on projects in the parks, recreation, and culture areas. So we went back and looked at the 2018 master plan for PRC. All of the other DCC projects were informed by 2018 master plans. We took these ones out of the 2018 PRC master plan to be consistent, and it also demonstrates that these are priority projects that have been on the books with the city for some time. We ensured that the approach that we were using is consistent with the community amenity charge program that was adopted last year, where council had identified specific priorities. So we've ensured that that's consistent there as well. And same with the DCC program, point number 3, there we're using the same assumptions as the DCC program for growth, for benefit allocation, and municipal assist factor. And then point number 4, last item there, small scale multi-unit housing, we're ensuring that we're incorporating that land use category as well to be consistent. Okay, I'm getting some details about the DCC program now, and these are the categories just shown in a different way than we did on our previous slide. There's the 5 existing, which are really 7, listed up there. Then we've got the 3 new ones, and we've identified some projects, fire halls in the fire protection category, a project in the police category. We at this time do not have any existing projects in solid waste and recycling, so none have been included for this update. There may be some when we do a full-scale update in a few years, but at this point, none in that 3rd category. Okay, I've mentioned keeping a lot of assumptions the same thing, land use categories, kept the same with the exception of that small-scale multi-unit housing. And we're going to slide that into the townhouse rate category, so keeping consistent with that particular rate category. I've got that point there, capital program is going to remain largely the same, so more detailed review after the OCP and master plan updates. We have had a few updates, minor updates to projects where we had sufficient information available. These were typically in the parks and the roads areas, and when we look at the total value of the projects that we added there, it equates to about 1% of the overall total value of all the programs put together. So wanted to mention that we've added them, but that's a relatively minor impact on what we'll see coming up. So also mentioned the cost of land and capital construction inflation, and then the inclusion of the highway projects. I should mention too on those highway projects too, because of the availability of funds in the roads DCC program, those do include financing costs, so borrowing costs are related to those projects. So that's made them a little bit more expensive as well. All right, so this is a big high-level summary of the DCC capital costs. If we look at that first column on the left, the total capital cost, those are in millions of dollars, and that's broken down by each of the different categories. Total at the bottom, $1.6 billion is the total cost of all those projects put together. The middle column, the recoverable costs, is the portion of those projects that is related to growth. So that is the amount that's recoverable through the DCC rates that we've calculated, and that 993 million feeds into the calculations, and then it gets divided by growth and so on to come up with these rates. So the middle column on this slide is the current DCC rates. The column to the right of that is the proposed ones, and then the percentage change on the very right is the increase. You'll see that most of them are in the 50% range, plus or minus. You can think of that percent change as a weighted average change, because if we were to take, say, single detached, a lot of those DCC programs, I think all of them that we looked at earlier, are factored into that single detached dwelling category. But if we move down the table and look at commercial or institutional, we do not have all of the categories feeding in there. For instance, we don't have parks being factored into commercial and institutional rates. And so that's the reason why you're seeing different percentage changes. Is we do have a significant increase, for instance, in the roads area, and the roads DCC program is more heavily weighted in commercial and institutional than it is in those other residential categories. So that's the reason for the big increases there. Agriculture, same kind of reasoning there, but in this case, the agricultural DCC, I believe it's only water treatment that feeds into that rate there, and that was going down by 10%. Okay, so we've done some comparisons with other cities. So I'll just go back to that rate slide for a moment in my discussion here and mention that when we come up with those rates, we're looking at the cost of growth, and we have a policy where we say growth needs to pay for itself. We don't want to burden existing residents with the cost of growth happening in the community, so developers should pay for the growth, and we've calculated what that is. When we come to this slide and do the comparisons, it's not because we're trying to say, well, let's see if we can match other cities, or like but we are looking at it to make sure that we're not out of line and try to ensure we know what's going on. So when we look at this, and this is single detached, I've got a number of other slides for other land use categories. Two things I want to point out before we get going through those. And so the first thing is you'll see that there's only two bars on this slide that have a red segment, and that's Burnaby and the proposed Abbotsford rate. That red one is fire, and then right to the left of it, you'll see a very small sliver of blue, which is police. So Abbotsford and Burnaby are the only two cities on this slide that have incorporated those new categories that are available by legislation. This is very new legislation. Once the other cities catch up and include those categories, we expect that their rates would go up accordingly. The second thing to notice on this slide is that Mission has a date of 2022. That's the oldest date on this slide, so the oldest rate. And Mission is currently in the process of updating their program and has very recently proposed new rates, which are quite a bit higher than what we see on these slides. So just those are some things to keep in mind as we try to provide as close to an apples to apples comparison as we can. So single detached, so getting into those. Here we've got Abbotsford's existing rate, and then the proposed one has us leapfrogging ahead of Mission, staying underneath all of those other ones. Keep in mind that the Mission one we expect to increase significantly.
What is the regional DCCs covering for those cities?
I believe it's primarily water and sewer, and
Translink as well.
and TransLink, yes. Yeah. But we don't show a regional DCC for Abbotsford because we take care of water treatment and sewer treatment in-house for Mission and Abbotsford, so they show up as part of our regular DCC. All right, so moving from single detached to townhouse, we've got Abbotsford moving up past Chilliwack and Mission. You can see that we've just barely nudged past Mission there, and I don't expect that's going to stay in that ranking for very long. For apartments, Abbotsford's amount has increased significantly, but we are still the lowest of the group. Same thing happening here for commercial. Same thing for industrial. Institutional is one area where we see Abbotsford moving up 3 categories, or in ranking. Okay, so talking about the ACC program, Amenity Cost Charge Program, and a reminder, very similar to DCC's, just opening up those new categories of working with parks and recreation types and culture type of infrastructure. There's a lot of overlap between the ACC program and our existing Community Amenity Charge Program that was adopted very recently. So I'll start by talking about that CAC and density bonusing program because of the amount of overlap there. So these are the existing rates for that program, and I'm quickly going to go to the next slide here to point out that when we bring in funding from those charges, that funding is allocated as per council's policy to 4 different categories. So the top one being affordable housing at 35%, and then we've got 3 other categories underneath that with the associated percentages. On the very left of the slide, you'll see the notes that say that those bottom 3 categories are all now able to be included in different programs, the ACC program, the DCC program. So what we're proposing to do is reduce this rate by 65% to reflect that we're not wanting to double charge for things. We'll just take it out of this program, and then we'll implement the ACC program and the DCC program in their place. We'll leave affordable housing where it is as part of the CAC and density bonusing rate. And so if we simply reduce this rate by 65% and leave that affordable housing component there, this is what we get when we compare the current rate and the proposed future rate with a 65% reduction. Okay, so getting on to ACC program categories. So one of the differences between the CAC program, the existing one, and this new ACC legislation is the CAC program dealt with broader types of categories. And so the policy explains what the main categories are, but it doesn't get into specific projects. ACC program legislation requires, very similar to DCC program legislation, that we identify specific projects. And so that's what's been done here. We've attempted, first of all, to take items out of existing master plans, I believe I mentioned that earlier, and ensure that they're consistent with the types of categories that were previously recognized as priorities in the CAC program. If you look at the bottom table on this slide, we've got a table that's very similar to what we saw in the DCC program. We've got total capital costs of $305 million. The ACC recoverable costs, or the portion of those projects that's deemed to be related or driven by growth, is $110 million. So that 110 is what is considered recoverable through this charge, and then factors into the rates that will be coming up shortly. So this slide here is just a page that was taken straight out of the PRC 2018 master plan, and just to demonstrate that the projects that we've identified as being included in this ACC program are consistent with what has already been identified as priorities by council in the 2018 master plan. I will emphasize that this was a 2018 document, so when you look at the dollar values of the projects on this slide, they are not going to be reflective of what's been included now because we're using updated cost estimates. So these are the proposed ACC rates. When we input all that information, I don't have any existing rates to compare to because the CAC program wasn't developed on a basis that could be compared in an apples-to-apples sort of way. But this is what we're proposing, and we were able to find some comparisons, not to the same extent as the DCC program, because as I mentioned earlier, only Burnaby has adopted an ACC or used the new legislation. And so with the ACCs, we've got actual numbers from Burnaby, and you'll see one other color of bar there, the gray ones, District of North Vancouver. They have not adopted an ACC program yet, but they are proposing one. So we were able to get comparable rates. So just to keep that in mind, but those are the comparables we were able to find. You can see with the per unit charges on the single detached townhouse and apartment that Abbotsford, the proposed ACC rate is significantly less than those 2 other comparators. And then on the land use categories where we're using gross floor area, there's a variety of different relationships that you can see there. Okay, so this is another slide that is taking an approach, again, because we only have North Van and Burnaby that had the ACC program in place. Those are our comparators for purpose of these slides, but we've taken the DCCs and the ACCs and then the regional DCCs for those other two cities, and then put them together and say, here's the total fees. Let's compare how Abbotsford is doing on different land use categories compared to the other two. So single detached, Abbotsford's, roughly maybe a little more than 2/3 of those other two. On townhouse, Abbotsford is less than half the amount of those other two, and then apartments were less than half again. So that's most of the kind of the background data and comparators that I've got. The last thing to consider is in-stream applications. So there's legislation for DCCs and now for ACCs that hasn't changed. So this is similar to other updates. When the new rates are effective, whether at bylaw adoption or if there's a date specified in the bylaw, those rates will become effective for any applications received after that point in time. For any applications that were received prior to that effective date, those applications will be subject to in-stream protection. So they can still benefit from existing rates before those rates are increased, but only as long as they meet one of the two criteria at the bottom of the slide, and that is that those in-stream applications have had building permits or subdivision applications granted within 1 year of bylaw adoption, or rezoning and development permit applications have resulted in building permit issuance within 1 year. So no change from prior updates, similar legislation. And then the last contextual type of slide we have here, we took a look at the total fees, the DCCs, ACCs, and remaining CACs that are being proposed, and asked the question, if someone was to go out and buy an apartment, how much of that apartment cost is these fees? And the same question for single detached. So we got these answers here. The apartment, those fees would make up about 8%, and for single detached, it'd be approximately 6%. And those are similar. They're in the same ballpark as what we looked at the last time we did a significant update to this program. All right, so I mentioned this is the fourth committee presentation that we've done this month, and we're looking for feedback. If there are comments that you think of after this meeting, we have a Let's Talk Abbotsford page that is easily accessible right off of the city's main webpage, and there's a form you can input comments into. There's also an email address listed on this slide and on the website as well, where you can contact our general manager of finance and procurement and provide comments that way. So we're gathering feedback through the month of September and planning to go to council with a draft bylaw in October. That concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Randy. A lot of info, but very clearly presented. Thank you, I appreciate that. Are there any comments or questions from the committee? I know you're probably still digesting and processing it, and that's okay.
Now, you'd mentioned something about transit was included in some of those. Can you expand on that a little bit? Like, how is that skewing the numbers? Is Burnaby not that much more expensive than us because they're paying into TransLink and we're not? Or how does that work?
That's an excellent question, and I'm looking at James. I'm not that familiar with the TransLink DCC and how we have a limited ability to include transit facilities in our own. I'm not sure.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, you're right that there's no transit DCC in an Abbotsford context. That said, within the context of all the charges that apply in Metro Vancouver, like even comparing the TransLink charges to the Metro Vancouver water and sewer charges, TransLink is a pretty small piece of the overall pie. So in many respects, it's the other components of the programs that are having the bigger impact.
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay, well, if you think of anything and you want to provide some input, as Randy says, there's the Let's Talk site on our website. So please do so. But otherwise, can we have a motion to receive? No, there is no sorry, we're not doing that. Just looking at my agenda, there is no recommendation. So we don't need a motion to receive, okay? Great, thanks. All right, but we do need a motion to adjourn. Moved by Matt, seconded by Spencer. All in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you very much for your time, everyone.